Hello. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm going to project from the diaphragm. Apparently, can you all hear me? All right. It's my inner theater, high school theater queen is ready to project. My name is Justin Hall, pronouns he, him. I'm the chair of the MFA in Comics program at California College of the Arts. And I am so excited to be here, at SF Zine Fest, which is this wonderful, venerable institution in the Bay Area that's done so much good for the comic scene here. But then also to be introducing Maia Kobabe, who is actually an alum of our program. So we've known each other for a long,
We met 10 years ago.
At least 10, no more, I think it's like 11.
Well, I started at CCA 10 years ago, in July of 2013.
Okay.
I think we did meet at least shortly before that, probably before I applied. So.
And neither of us have changed at all.
No, we're exactly the same,
So Maia, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Maia Kobabe. I use the pronouns em, er. I'm the author of Genderqueer, a memoir. A book about my life, many details. You can know many things about me. That has won some awards and also garnered some challenges. And I love comics, and I'm very, very happy to be here and honored to be the guest at SF Zine Fest this year.
Yeah, thank you. And you did this incredible poster.
I did, yes.
Tell us about this. What was it like to do the poster, and how did you approach it?
I really love nature themes. There's a lot of plants in my artwork, and that's something sometimes people ask me about in interviews. Is like, wow, there's so many nature metaphors. What's that about? And it's like, I grew up in the California forests and fields. This is. Well, I think when I think of metaphors, often plant and nature metaphors are what comes to my mind. And so I knew I had a lot of text I had to fit in here. Obviously, we had to have the title and the venue and all of these things. But I also really wanted to allude to the bans and challenges towards books that have been happening, but in a little bit more of an exciting and positive way rather than a scary way. Because I also knew this is something I want people to want to look at it and enjoy looking at it. So I sort of came up with this phrase, can't burn us, can't bury us, referencing books, but also sort of minority identities, especially the ones that people are trying to sort of erase from the public sphere at the moment. And then I also just wanted to fill it full of a bunch of stuff that I like. I like bugs and butterflies and bees. And then there's the art print version of this that some people have seen where we didn't need the bottom text. I fit there's some zine supply. There's the long arm stapler and the pencil, but also a sword and some D&D dice, and just trying to make it fun,
D&D dice, that's fantastic. It's and to your point about marginalized identities, I also just have to sort of point out how remarkable. I was just talking to someone on the stairs about this. It wasn't that long ago that being queer in the comics world felt like a completely
it felt
invisible.
Like a rarity.
Yes.
I went to a wonderful talk you did with Bishak Som a couple weeks ago at CCA, and Bishak is a trans author, and they talked about dipping into the comics community in the early 90s and being like, this is a boys club, and I don't feel like I belong here as a trans femme person. And then coming back kind of after the 20-teens and being like, oh, there's a whole new scene now.
Yeah. There are queers everywhere.
Yes, especially at this event.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. And it's great.
Yes. So I wanted to sort of thinking about the past. This is a self-portrait you did a number of years ago.
Yes.
And one of the things that I find interesting when doing memoir in general in comics is that you have to draw yourself at different stages in your life.
Over and over.
Over and over ad nauseum. And at different stages in your life, right? You have to sort of imagine yourself at these different stages. But of course, as artists, we oftentimes do self-portraits at these different stages. So when you look back to this, who were you? Who are you presenting as in this moment of your life? What's your relationship to this person now?
Yeah, I think this is drawn, there's not a date on it, but I would guess maybe 2012-ish, maybe 11, somewhere in that zone. And I still see a lot of myself in this. I still see the person who is an introvert and feels most comfortable being at home in my comfy clothes, just bending over my sketchbook all day. But I also look at this and I'm like, dang, I used to just hatch everything to death, didn't I? This was back when I was working at 100% traditionally. This was probably drawn with Micron pens on a Strathmore paper, and I do a lot of work digitally now. But yeah, and I look back and I'm like, yeah, there's a little Maia. There's a little, just maybe between college and grad school Maia. And back when my work was much more influenced by sort of medieval and Renaissance and historical themes, which I still love that. I'm very drawn to those aesthetics, but it's not sort of where my work has taken me in recent years. But yeah, that's very much how I saw myself, I would say, in my early 20s, was like this person who almost felt like a medieval monk trapped in the modern era.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I want to return to some of that because that sort of image pops up a number of times in your work. But of course, you're best known at this point for genderqueer, as you said. Describe a little bit about, these are two different covers for the book. A little bit about the publishing history. Like, when did the first version come out? When did the second version come out? Yeah.
I mean, the very, very earliest version of this book, which at least one person at this show today brought me, the tiny baby little zine, was a series of small black and white diary comics that ran on Instagram from, like, I think mid-2017, mid-2016 through mid-2017. And at first, it was not supposed to be a book. We didn't think of it as a book. I thought of it as a tool to come out to my community. I was trying to come out as non-binary, and even though I had a very supportive set of family and friends, I also had a lot of people who I would come out to, and they would be like, "We love you, we support you, and we have no idea what you're talking about." And so then I was like, I think I really need to start writing about this. I don't know that I'm going to get my point across and really express everything I want to express just in conversation. So I wrote all these little journal comics, and then I pitched it as a book. And my initial pitch had been like, do you want to just publish all these little comics I've already drawn? And they actually said no to that. But then they said, would you take the same material and develop into full-size pages, do it in color, more of a narrative instead of series of vignettes? And I said yes. And that was in like January of 2018. And then I spent a year reworking the book, redrawing it, coloring it. I worked too hard. I did not, it was my first book. I didn't know my own limits. I was working like 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for like 8 months. And
don't do that.
Don't do that.
Boundaries.
Don't do that. And it meant that when the book came out, and then after touring, I was so exhausted I basically couldn't work for 6 months after that. So it's like, you burn the candle too far and then you pay for it later. But the first version, which is on that side, I'm dyslexic, came out in May of 2019, the same month that I turned 30.
Okay.
And then the special edition came out last year. After kind of this book, the second half of the life of this book, which is like after the challenges, after the bans, after suddenly this level of attention and publicity that I had not had earlier in my career.
So, I mean, to speak to that, I mean, this is a little piece that you did about that sort of journey of the book, right? So what was the timeline there? Like the initial version of the book comes out, and then it sort of, does well for a small, first, publication, and then it suddenly gets attention later. Yeah,
it was out for about 2.5 years of just kind of a peaceful existence of like, it was doing well. I was happy with it as a, as a debut book from a relatively small publisher and an unknown author. I was pleased with its early success. It sold well. It was very well received by librarians. It received the 2 awards that it won were from the American Library Association, which was an Alex Award and a Stonewall Honor. Many of the books that have been challenged recently are Alex winners. That award goes to books that are for adults, but that have crossover appeal for teens and live in this sort of blurry zone of like, what is the age group of this book is for. It often features a teen character, but with some sort of reference to maybe there's themes of sexuality, or there's themes of assault, or it talks about racism, or like a little bit more of a challenging topic. And those are the books that have been hit by the bans. It's also because ALA, the American Library Association, pretty much all librarians in the country purchase the award winners. So that means they're in every public library, which means that if someone is like, oh shoot, I read about this book in another district, and is that book in my school district too, or my library? It is. So it's like, you can't challenge it unless it's like there to be challenged. And so because the award winners are there, they are in a weird way more vulnerable to challenges, or they're more available to challenges, I guess you could say. But yeah, I had like 2 years of it just like moving along, like selling, doing well, me being happy, but being like, okay, I need to think about my next book. And then the challenges started in like fall of 2021 around the midterm election. And then I've had 2 years of like a completely different experience of being the author of this book, which is like a pretty intense level of media attention. Like in the first couple weeks, I was literally getting so many interview requests that had I said yes to all of them, I would have just been doing interviews from like 9 to 5, 5 days a week, and not doing any writing or drawing.
What was the inciting incident that sort of began this?
I mean, it was a little tumble of things. I think it got challenged in like a couple school districts in Texas, and then it got challenged in a couple school districts in the state of Virginia, and then it was just like a bunch of copycat challenges. It was like, and then, like a conservative parent would like read about a challenge in one place and then literally repeat the language from that challenge in another school district, and then another, and then another, and another. And then this group called Moms for Liberty, a very hypocritical name, got founded, which is conservative parents who then literally are building like text of like how to challenge a book and just sending it out to like members across the nation, and they're just repeat challenging books that clearly the challenger has never even read. So
this whole process, I mean, I'm sure lots of things to grapple with. I'm wondering about your relationship to audience here. Like, who is the audience that you imagined for the book initially? Do you feel like it sort of reached that audience? And then who is the audience that these Moms for Liberty types imagine it's for? And then what's the final audience do you think that the book has actually achieved now that it's been banned, that it's gotten all this more publicity, you know?
I mean, honestly, the people that I was first imagining the book to be for was like my parents.
Yeah, right.
My aunts and uncles, my cousins, my artist friends. It's sort of, especially outside of like my besties, but sort of my more like professional community. Yeah. And because I was thinking like this book is to come out to people that I know, and also like I was having such a hard time figuring out where in the steps of meeting people to say like, oh yeah, I use non-binary pronouns. And then I was like, but if I publish a book that's called Genderqueer, and I'm introducing myself as a new person, I can be like, hi, I'm Maia Kobabe. I read a book called Genderqueer. By the way, I'm non-binary and use these pronouns. And I was like, perfect. This will just solve that little conversational problem.
It was just for conversational issues. Okay, fair
honestly,
enough.
So that was sort of how I was thinking of it. And then I was also very hopeful that other people who are questioning their gender would find it a useful way to maybe like a prompt where you could like look at it, and especially if you're trying to have that conversation with like a friend or a partner or a parent, be like, see this page, I relate to this one, or maybe this page not so much, or like it's like this for me but different, and you could almost use it as a way to like start those conversations that I myself was having a really hard time starting.
Though I would also say that that it functions in all those ways, and I've definitely sent the book myself to people who are like in my extended groups or whatever that were wanted to find out more about non-binary identities. But on the other hand, it's also very personal. It's not just a sort of like
it's not a how-to guide.
It's not a how-to guide.
It's a memoir.
Yeah, it's a very personal piece about yourself. So how does that piece of it relate to audience?
I mean, I think part of it was that there were a couple books like sort of like how to explain pronouns and stuff that came out before mine, and I personally, as an adult who was sort of already semi-out as queer, found they weren't giving me what I needed. Yeah. Like, and I was often like read them and be like, yeah, this is really great, like 101, or this would be great for like a 12-year-old, but like I'm in my late 20s, and like I'm like it's not quite going far enough. Yeah. And I also felt like, specifically in the sense of wanting to explain it to my parents and my family, I kept trying to explain these little pieces, like it's important, the pronouns are important because of this, but it would feel maybe very unrelated. And I was like, I just need to sit down and say, like, these are all of the ways that like gender has impacted my life, and all of these moments where like gender has like affected me, or like affected the conversation or interaction I was having, or impacted a relationship I had, and just put them all out and say, this is why it matters. And even if each one of these things feels quite small, when you put them all together, they make like a bigger pile than any piece alone. And like sometimes like I thought about when I was writing the book that I was like trying to put a puzzle together, like a jigsaw puzzle, except I'd lost the picture on the top of the box. Like I did not know what the big picture was yet, because I was just trying to fit all these little things together. And there's this hope of like, once I have finished, hopefully I too will be able to see this bigger picture. Yeah,
but I mean, there's something really powerful about having sort of an authentic emotional context for questions around identity, right? That makes this sort of book go so much farther and be so much more profound than a how-to book or a sort of a guide to pronouns or whatever. So to back up a little bit, when I think of you're such a genre person, right? Like you were very much into fantasy and speculative fiction and all this stuff.
I was so sure my first book was going to be a YA fantasy novel.
Yes,
for years, I was sure that was going to be the case.
Well, I mean, you were working on this piece,
on forever hiatus webcomic. This is a series called The Thief's Tale. That's what I applied to CCA with and was my thesis project. And I worked on it for like 5 years, and I think I drew close to 150 pages of this book, and they are just sitting in my closet.
Yeah.
I also, like, I'm very grateful to this story, and it taught me a lot about making comics and meeting my own deadlines and treating myself like a professional.
Yes.
And all of that, but it also has a lot of early writing flaws because I was writing it in my early 20s, and I was a pretty like naive person who just hadn't taken any creative writing classes, and like, you know, I also came from like a pretty like white, sheltered, middle class Bay Area background, not that diverse, frankly. And so like every single character in the first draft of the story was white, and you know, just like kind of mistakes you make as an early writer who hasn't thought too critically yet about stories and representation.
I just did the intro for Spitball, which is a Columbus College of Art and Design. Their students, their comic students, illustrate stories that are then written by professional cartoonists, and Maia is one of the professional cartoonists contributing a script. So, and I've seen you collaborate multiple times as an artist with other writers, but never had seen you as a writer with another artist.
Yeah, that was my first time.
It was
It was my first time being the writer half of a writer-artist partnership. Yeah,
and it was a memoir piece of writing.
Yeah.
And then the illustrator then illustrated themselves, I think, really as you almost, which is fascinating.
It was a really interesting little project. This is a school in Columbus, Ohio that has a really great comics program, and several alumni from our program teach there. But it's like they asked the seniors in the comics program to work with a professional writer and get the whole experience of like, you know, thumbnailing and checking in with a writer and then coloring it and then book design and then selling it at a show, really every step of what you do with comics. And yes, they asked if I wanted to write a 5-page script for a student artist to draw, and I racked my brains trying to come up with a fictional story, and I just couldn't think of anything that short that felt meaningful. So I was like, I'm going back to memoir. That's my home territory. And so I wrote a short memoir piece, and I actually told the artist, like, I'm going to leave it in your hands. You can draw me if you want. You can draw yourself if you want, or you can make up a totally fictional character if you want. And so they kind of drew a kind of them-ish character, but that's also a little fictionalized. And I was like, that's great. That's fantastic. I love it.
But one of the things that you talk about in this short piece, in this short script, is that you specifically that you had started, you know, making this fantasy stories, and it always felt like a slog, right? I think the allegory you used was sort of
wading through mud.
Yeah, right. And then you figured out a way, once you got into memoir, that you were sort of skipping across stones.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is something something that I've realized about my own writing practice is like, if it feels really, really hard and bad, it probably means you're not ready to tell this story, or it's not the right story to be telling right now. And if it feels like every time you're working on it, it's like, oh God, this is such a struggle and it's really hard, like maybe set it down. Maybe that's your inner self like telling you like, this isn't what we want to be doing, or this isn't right, or something about the approach is not working. And unfortunately, or for better or worse, but again, it was my first story. Like a lot of working on this story felt that slogging through mud, because again, all of these writing problems, and also I was trying to work in a very, very detailed style that was hard to maintain that level of detail.
It's gorgeous, but
I do love drawing fancy buildings.
All those bricks.
Every brick. But yeah, and then when I started writing like the memoir stuff, the earliest parts of genderqueer, it just like flowed out of me. It was just like, oh shoot, there's this realization like, oh my gosh, I have so much to say. And once I also simplified my style and did the more like a more cartoony, blocky, simple style, less backgrounds, which is more what you see in genderqueer, the process just sped up so immediately, became much faster, much easier, and it wasn't easy in the sense that it didn't require work, but it was easy in the sense that I didn't feel like I was fighting against myself. And that is now that feeling that I sort of try to chase now in my writing, is like when when I'm in the right zone and I'm working on the right story, it will kind of come to me, and it won't feel hard in the way that a story that is not working will feel hard.
There's also, I mean, I think when you're stripping down your style into something that's less detailed, there's a sort of, you know, strength and confidence that can come through. I mean, looking at this is beautiful work, but then your work became more confident. Do you see that in terms of visually as well?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And just, I also think I realized, I think with this story, I could tell, I knew that the story was weak, and I was trying to carry a weak story with strong art. And then when I realized that my story was strong, I realized the art only needed to be just good enough to tell the story and like no more. And also I was like, oh shoot, I have a lot to say and I have a lot to write, and there's a lot of books I want to make. and it would behoove me to go a little faster.
Yes.
And and now I'm kind of like, and it's like, I love drawing complicated, beautiful art, but a lot of my work now is, the mentality is like, draw as little as you can get away with without sacrificing clarity.
Yeah, right. It's cartooning as a language. It's not just about pretty pictures.
Yeah.
So here's
this is the simple style.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, so this is the stuff you mentioned about the mini comics.
This is the early drafty stuff that I was just thinking of as a tool to come out with, basically.
Now, and it transitioned. I mean, you talked about having to recreate some of these vignettes and put them into context, and then add color and all these elements. So, so talk about this sort of moving from one to the other.
Yeah, so as you can see, that's dated 2016. This is actually a version that I redrew for an editorial in the Washington Post in fall of 2021, so five years later. So you can see, though, I basically just traced that little panel that I drew much longer ago into that one, and it's relatively, I mean, I adjusted the body language a little bit, but it's the same concept, but I've done it digitally, and now I've inked it, or I've colored it, so there's like full color. But honestly, I have kind of developed this style, and it's very influenced by a couple of cartoonists. I would say like Alison Bechtel, Erica Moen, Lucy Nisley, and who's the author of American Elf?
James Kolchaka.
James Kolchaka. Those are kind of the people that I was reading and kind of drawing from at that time. And then I also feel like this style, and like N.D. Stevenson, kind of just like make everybody like only 4 heads tall and dot eyes, and so that we got to drop that there are only so many hours in the day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it has that sort of the ligne claire, the sort of Hergé punch to it. So this is like a couple pages from Genderqueer, and again, it really, I think, highlights the sort of your stylistic elements here, especially on the right side, of that sort of clean line, clear style. But you also aren't afraid to get experimental. I mean, you do these, this is an extremely experimental sort of page here. So how did you decide when and how to experiment in the book?
Something really unlocked for me when I was working on Genderqueer, and I realized that I could do some pages that looked like sketchbook pages. And I realized like I can do whatever I want. But also being like, most of the story I want to tell in kind of a traditional panels that speech bubbles and moving along. But also, I like in my sketchbook, I do a lot of like pages that just have like an image with text or like different things like that, and I was like, oh, I can just, this is a memoir. It can look like my journal. Like I can just do pages that feel like what I would do in my journal or my diary. And when I realized I could do that, I was like, excellent. And there's like a set of pages around 60 to 65 that are mostly full page spreads, and that's the kind of thing that I would draw. That's very like my sketchbook style.
So was that something you figured out as you were transitioning those little mini comics into the book?
Yeah.
So the other thing I wanted to sort of mention was this: that you've got this element of that that Mari Naomi, this first teacher at CCA, asked about writing down your sort of greatest secrets. So
yes, a challenging assignment.
Sort of a life-changing assignment.
Yes, a life-changing assignment. I know, and I talked to Mari about it now because Mari is also now a frequently banned author. So we've been on a lot of panels together, and I love talking with them and being like, you gave me this assignment that I then like wrestled with for 5 years. You know what I mean? Like that's an assignment.
Yeah.
Because it was in like 2013, and they asked us to do this. And we're in a new grad program. I'm in a new school. I'm with like 12 other students that I've just met days before, and this teacher's saying, write about your deepest, darkest secrets, and I'm like, is this what grad school's about? And at the time, I was like, I don't want to do that. And then it wasn't until like 3 years later that I was like, okay. I think I'm ready. I'm ready to do that assignment that I kind of half-assed 3 years ago.
And that's, I mean, speaking as a teacher, like that's such a remarkable sort of thing to hear, that like even if an assignment doesn't land, like initially, like it can actually come back and sort of sneak around and end up being.
You never know what seeds you've planted.
Really, it's wild. Oh, and
This is one of the pages I was talking about. This is like what I would consider a sketchbook page. Like this doesn't have any comics panels.
Yeah.
There's no speech bubbles, but it's like a drawing that is trying to express a concept that is like half image, half text. And this is the kind of thing when I realized, oh, I can just put pages that are like this amongst the pages of more traditional panels. I was like, aha.
And they're stunning. Like there's, I mean, I think in a lot of ways because they're different, like they really pop in the book, and it's what people will pull from oftentimes, right?
Yeah,
The
this page
showstopper.
and the ones on sort of either side of it are like the most frequently, I think, used and like pulled for articles stuff.
Yeah. I also love the coloring here, also with the, so often there's the sort of gendered nature of color, and this idea of sort of pink is feminine and blue, which was reversed in the beginning of the 20th century, right? And here you've got this sort of bluer colors being and it also sort of references these older stories of, was it Socrates that had the two souls that were split?
In the Symposium. Definitely that's something I read in high school and I reference later in the book as well. And again, it's more the nature, more metaphor of like, I think like, especially with the growing plant, I was thinking of it more almost as day and night than like male and female. And I also have to say, I did not color this book. This book was colored by my sibling, Phoebe Kobabe, who is also a digital artist and came out as non-binary about a month before the book was published. So uses they, them pronouns now. Yes, cheers for that. And did an amazing job because I was not a very confident digital colorist at the time this was coming out. And I was like, can I have my sibling do it? And that was really great to be able to collab with them. Partly because a story about my childhood is of course going to be a story of their childhood as well. We're only 2 years apart and we both lived in the same bedroom until we moved out for college. And so I didn't have to like give them like a bunch of reference photos of like, this is what our childhood home looked like, or this is, because they were there, they knew. And it also, I think it helped keep me honest a little bit. Like if I was I wasn't like tempted to like, I don't know, fake things or anything, but there'd be moments where Phoebe was like, it's not quite how I remembered it. And I'd be like, okay, well.
But that's always such an interesting question about memoir, right? Like, what is, because factual truth, in a way, if you're thinking about the audience, factual truth doesn't necessarily sort of matter as much as authenticity,
and
right?
like the emotional truth.
Yes.
And it's also hard because like the book starts when I'm like 2.5 years old. And like I have a very good memory and I also care about memory and I also am quite an extensive journaler. But I didn't start journaling until I was 12. So I have tons of journal entries that I read from age like 12 to 22. But the scenes that are before 12, I had to just remember and be like, well, I'm writing it to the best of my ability to remember what happened, but also this was 2 decades ago or more, so it is what it is.
Did you interview your sibling, your parents about these sort of things, or you just sort of let your own?
Not really. I just sort of wrote what I remembered and then I let them read drafts afterward and comment if they had any comments. And pretty much every single person who appears in the book who is not me, who is like a named character, got to read the scenes that they're in and comment on them. And I made some small edits based on people's feedback of like, I remember that differently. And that was really important to me because it's like I didn't want anyone to be shocked by their own appearance in this book. I wasn't like trying to call anyone out. And I really, like, this was a book meant to like build bridges, not burn them. And so I really wanted everyone who was in the book to feel like comfortable and proud of their own appearance in it, and and be able to, when it came out, be excited for me and celebrate it, not be like, oh God, what has Maia written about me? That kind of thing. That was not what I wanted.
And I think that ethos comes through because there are obviously a lot of memoirs that are really about reclaiming certain kinds of trauma that then deal with with the people around you. But as you said, this was primarily for you a way to communicate with the people in your life.
And I was blessed and privileged with a fairly easy and a fairly like chill childhood in many ways. And I have like a loving family and an accepting family and all of this. And it was like so many of my struggles were very internal. And I actually worried because of that like the book would be kind of boring because I was like, I didn't face any external conflict at any point. But it turns out a lot of people have internal struggles, so they related to it.
That is relatable.
Yeah,
yes, it's true.
It worked out.
So I'm gonna once this gets dealt with, I'm gonna show on the next slide, which is sort of trigger warning. I think it's maybe one of the most difficult pages in the book. This image of the sort of being pierced through, and it's one of the things that I remember when first hearing that this book was being banned, and my first response was, oh, it must be these really difficult images.
Yeah.
One would think, because
Yeah.
I still think that people should be able to see this stuff, but I can understand a conversation around, these are traumatic images, who should be able to see them, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And, yeah, like that, no, this way. Technical
This is tech
fun.
intermission.
There we go.
I'll drink us some water.
Excellent, thank you. But in fact, the images that were a problem were not that at all. It was what there's a strap-on dildo, right? In a brief little moment, right? And I've been in San Francisco for a long time. Like I live next door to Good Vibration, so like it hadn't even occurred to me. Like strap-on dildos are just sort of like a neighborhood, like it's like a flower in the neighborhood. I don't know. Like, come on.
Yeah, but we're in the Bay. This is not the nation.
But
No.
I do want to sort of return to this question of audience, because then obviously for the censors here, the people are trying to ban the book, that their idea of who the audience is very different than your idea. And then
Yes.
and then who becomes the audience then after all this extra publicity happens, and who are you finding actually reading the book now?
Yeah, I mean, the good people of the San Francisco Zine Fest are reading the book.
Yes.
I don't know. Yeah, it seems to me that people who want to ban and censor my book are thinking that I wrote it because I want to turn children trans.
Right.
And that is not the case. I mean, I was like, the thing is, the kids are trans already.
Yeah,
I didn't need to do anything. I wrote it for people who are already asking these questions, already like searching for this type of information, and also their friends, family, loved ones, coworkers, etc., who want to understand a person in their life or just are curious about this. And it has been interesting. I mean, I definitely get a lot of messages from readers who are like high school or early college saying, I'm just starting to figure this out, or I've been questioning this and I didn't really know the words for it. But I also get messages from parents saying like, thank you so much for this book. Like, I understand my child better now.
Yeah.
And I get messages from people who are 40s, 50s, 60s saying like I probably would have come out earlier if I'd had this language, or if I knew like this counted as trans, this type of experience. And then I also get messages from cis readers who are either just saying like, thank you for opening a window, an experience I didn't have, or say, I still identify as cis, but I'm surprised by how much of this I relate to. Yeah.
That was
and and then even people, I get messages from like doctors and nurses who say like, oh, this is going to help me be a better caregiver to my trans patients, all sorts. I think it has had a much wider readership than I suspected that it would have, which has been wonderful.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is. Come on. Yeah, this is the image again that was so difficult, and it's a very, very powerful image. So thank you for illustrating this. And again, this is the thing that I would have expected.
It was actually worse in the first draft, and I toned it down.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Tell us.
Before there was like a pool of blood under it, and I was like, that's going too far. That's going too far.
Yeah. And the lettering, I've always loved your lettering. So
I hand-lettered this whole book, which was a delight, and then also has been a challenge. I made so many spelling errors in the first draft. I can't spell anything, and then also it means that for every foreign translation they have to like re-letter it and figure out how they're going to do that, because it's now been translated into quite a number of foreign languages. And like we did develop a font based on my handwriting, which some of the translations use, but it depends on like how different the language is than English. And like it's getting its first translations into non-Roman alphabet languages right now. Currently it's being translated into Korean and Japanese, and I'm so curious to see what that looks like, because it's going to look pretty different with the different alphabets.
Do you have any sort of say about that, about how the lettering goes, or?
It depends. Some of the translations I've consulted on more closely than others, because each one has to figure out what are they going to do about the pronouns, because pronouns are different in every language. Of
course.
And for like Spanish was the very first one, and then French and Italian, they kind of went with like, those Romance languages are kind of developing a non-binary verb ending of usually E instead of A or O, which is, it was pretty widely used at this point. And so they all kind of went that route. But like, it's also been translated into like Polish and like Czech. And I remember when I was talking to, I think it was the Czech translation, they're like, we do have one non-binary pronoun set. It's the royal we. You'll sound like a dick if you use that for yourself. So don't use that,
And,
So-
and everything is gendered in Czech too.
Yeah.
I taught for a semester as a Fulbright
Yeah.
scholar in Czech Republic, and everything
Yeah.
was like, even the
Yeah.
way you call out to someone is.
Yeah. Yeah, and then things like in the Korean translation, there are some words that are also gendered in a way that we don't do in English. Like I hope I'm getting this right. I think it's like the words for an aunt from your mother's side of your family and aunt from your father's side of the family is two slightly different words. Whereas in English we would just say aunt for either side, and the same thing. Cousin is non-binary, and
Right.
we also don't determine a cousin from your father's side or your mother's side and that kind of thing. So like yeah, there's been at least a few things every language has had to reach out to me to be like, either how would you suggest we do this, or here we need some clarifications. It's been very interesting to see like what, and because I actually use two different, because I use they them pronouns and EMR pronouns in the English version. So like how many languages have two non-binary pronoun sets? And so sometimes they'll just use what we did in English and footnote it. But my preference is for the translation to use whatever non-binary and trans people are developing and using in that language.
Right.
And I always tell every translator, I want their translation to be useful rather than faithful.
Yeah,
Because it's that, like, I want this book to be a resource and a tool to the people who are reading it in whatever language they're reading it. And like, please, like, literally chuck out anything in the English that's like not useful to a trans person in this country.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
By the way, we're getting. If people have some questions for Maia, we're gonna have some time for questions. So start thinking of those as well. I just wanted to show this slide because this is a beautiful. I mean, you've taken a page from Genderqueer and made it into a poster, and it also just speaks to the to your lovely handwriting, hand lettering, but also the this idea of sort of poetic truth.
Yeah.
Which is and both visual and textual.
Yeah. Yeah, this was, on that side is the page from the book, and like many people have told me that that's their favorite page in the whole book. And it's definitely one of my favorites as well. And many people also asked me like, can I buy this as like a poster or something? And I was like, always like, I felt a little weird pulling one page out of the book and selling it separately. I'm also like not sure that's allowed in my contract. Anyway, but when we did the hardcover edition, we did this sort of limited edition print that they sold, and also we donated some money from the proceeds to the Trans Lifeline. And I made that the sort of quote that everybody loves and that I love from that into this more artistic version. And this is another reason why like I'm grateful that I wrote this book, because like this metaphor of like gender as a landscape and sort of transition as a journey through geography was like not something I had in my brain before I sat down to write this book and was like, how do I explain this? And I feel like there are several metaphors, like the metaphor of the scale and this, that came to me because I was sitting in front of a blank sheet of paper with a pencil in my hand being like, how do I explain this? And I don't know that I would have come to them except that I was sitting there being like, how? And like trying to think of ways and metaphors to explain it. So again, specifically to like my loving, accepting cisgender parents who like really support me, but just have never interrogated their own gender at any point in their lives, and now have two non-binary children.
And it's not didactic. It's not sort of condescending. It's not angry. It's all these. It's a sort of like lovely and poetic, and also very authentic and truthful. Right.
Yeah, I think for me, like you have to mention several we've talked about audience throughout this panel. Like for me, it was like one of the keys was like writing towards an audience of people who loved me. Like I am not writing this book for haters. I am not writing this book for conservatives. I am not even really writing this book to change anyone's minds. I am writing this book to build understanding with someone who loves me. And like that is why the tone of the book is very compassionate, because that's who I was writing towards.
Which I think makes it more powerful ultimately, but you know. I wanted to talk briefly about also the stuff that you've done since the book. And you know, you talked about your top surgery here, and then also in this really beautiful poetic piece. This like brought me to tears. I thought it was gorgeous. And it's just this sort of like, you know, you've come so far as a cartoonist, as a poet, as an artist, and also as a memoirist in particular. So how do you see this, you know, this sort of transition in terms of your own artistic abilities and what you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for saying that. I feel like I have been growing my voice and developing my voice, and part of it is like gaining more confidence in myself and like what I have to say, and that people will find what I have to say useful and valuable. And then it's also like I still find like when I have those thoughts that kind of get stuck in my head and loop in my head, and I find myself repeating to this like thought, sometimes the kind of thing you think before night. Like I don't use Twitter, and I never have, but the kind of thing that maybe you would tweet on the site formerly known as Twitter. I try to like write that down instead. And like if I can get it out in journaling and then I'm like done thinking about it, I'm like, okay. But if I journal about it and I still kind of have it in my head, I'm like, okay, I think I need to make a comic about this. And what I usually do is like I just like write like a bullet point version of it, and then I start coming up with some images. And that process has also been such an important way for me to help me like clarify my thoughts. And I feel like anything, and it's also like if I don't get tired of what I'm trying to say by the time I'm done drawing it, then it's worth publishing. Yeah. Is my opinion, kind of. Great. Or if at some point through I'm like, like I don't know, I don't feel like finishing this one. Then I'm like, I guess that idea wasn't like important enough. But like I feel like comics making has become such a way for me to like think through comics and also like figure out what I am actually trying to say through the process of making a comic about it. Yeah. And it's been really, really like personally useful. Yeah. Language. Yeah. I mean, that's fantastic. You've also, again, we mentioned that you've worked with other people as an artist, with other writers. This is, and also I feel like you're continuing to expand your sort of experimental approach to comics. Yeah. This is from a short fictional story that's like 20 pages that I have on my table out there. It's called The Final Project. And this is one I actually was working on around the same time as genderqueer, and now it's funny looking back at it that I'm now working on a fictional book as well, and these characters in some ways almost look like a prototype version of the characters from my next fictional book, and it's interesting how ideas like sort of recycle like that. Yeah. And this is from Theater of Terror, which was written, a story about a trans werecat in 1930s Paris that was written by the late great Rachel Pollack. Yes, that was an anthology that Justin organized, and I got paired with a magnificent writer, and I'm so happy to have been able to collaborate with her at least once. It was a delight, and so this was also a time where I was working as just the artist half of an artist-writer team. Yeah. She was a wonderful person. Yes. This is also like, I just love this as a sort of final image. Describe this project here. Yeah, this was a comic that I actually adapted from a poem by a Czech poet that I just really loved. The story is called the poem's called Fairy Tale, and it's a sort of a story about like leaving home for the first time, or at least that's how I read it. And at the time I was like having to move out of my childhood home after like 20 years and feeling really a lot of the feelings about it. So I drew this comic about kind of like packing up your childhood home, packing up the garden and the sky and the house, and sort of carrying it with you. And it's also, this is the first comic I ever drew where I used specific pronouns. And and I did it in watercolor, and it's and like also like drawing, and then using like kind of the technique of a same character repeated throughout a static image to show sort of like the passage of time. And it was both formally interesting and very what I needed emotionally in the moment when I was saying goodbye to a place that I really loved. All that watercolor also completely terrifies me because watercolor is so unforgiving. It just makes me like, oh, if you do anything wrong. It's so funny because I used to actually, my main color media used to be colored pencils, like what Melanie Gilman works in, and I actually gave up colored pencils for watercolor because I thought watercolor was easier than colored pencils. Or at least it's faster, because colored pencils, if you want to cover a big area, you gotta just shade forever. And I really liked a dark, vivid color, and I was like pressing so hard with my colored pencils that I was leaving like dents in my fingertips, and I was like, this is not sustainable. I'm going to wear my wrist out with this media. And then watercolor, you can just shade an area much more quickly with a big brush, and you can hold the tool, or at least I hold the tool much more lightly, and I sort of switched to watercolors. I was like, this is better for my wrists. And also, I don't know, watercolor, you make mistakes, but like usually what I do is I start 3 paintings at a time, and I'm working on 3, and at least one of them maybe will get effed up, but like I still got the other 2. Oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay, all right. You seem to be very good about like, okay, this isn't working, I can let it go. Because some artists have a hard time letting go. That's a good strategy. I mean, you got to grieve it. Yeah, like when I gave up on The Thief's Tale, it was partly because I pitched it to an agent who told me fairly harshly, this is unpublishable, and that was hard to hear. It was hard to hear after having worked on a story for 5 years and thought this is my debut book and all of that. But basically, I had to sit there. At first, I had to be like, all the steps. Like I had to be angry about it, and then I had to be realistic about it, and I had to think about it, and then then eventually I agreed with it, and then I gave up on that story, and then it opened the door for me to do something else, which was genderqueer. And skip across those stones, across the muddy field, or whatever the allegory is.
So I want to ask about your newest project, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. So what is the project you're working on right now?
Yeah, so I'm working on a book called Sachi Stories. I'm writing with a co-author, Lucky Srikumar, whose table is right next to mine, out in the 130, 131 area. And a lot of where it came from is tons of parents and also some like teachers and librarians asked me in 2019 when I was touring with Genderqueer, like, would you ever make an all ages version of this book? Because not my gender nonconforming kiddo is like 8 or like 10 or like 6, which is too young for genderqueer. And I said, I don't want to abridge my memoir. That feels weird. Yeah. But I could write a new book. Like clearly there's an ask. There's an ask for a book about these topics, but that's for younger readers. And so Sachi Stories is trying to be kind of that. It's very much still about gender, about identity, about sexuality, but it also like friendship pressure and puberty and coming of age and peer pressure in like junior high years. So it's been really wonderful to work on. I'm enjoying working on a fiction story. I love working with a co-author, and we are not doing like a writer-artist team. We are both writing and we're both doing art. It's a very intermeshed process. And we read a little sample of it at the Thinking Captions reading at Silver Sprocket on Friday. So the amount of people that are in the room have like seen a little sample. And then I actually also just sold another book, which is called Breathe, Journeys to Healthy Binding. It's much shorter, it's nonfiction. It's coming out from Dutton, an imprint of Penguin Random House. And I worked on that also with a co-author who's a researcher at the University of Michigan who did a long-running study of health effects of chest binding for transmasculine folks, both like physical and also emotional, mental, and turned a research document into a comic script, and we have made it into a sort of comic that also has then some like statistics and information and like journaling prompts and that kind of stuff. So.
Interesting. Do you find, like, are you able to insert sort of emotional, what we were talking before about sort of your bringing memoir elements into, and it combined with the sort of information of genderqueer, were you able to find emotional elements to the?
Yeah, partly because part of the research study was interviewing many people who had bound for multiple years and then taking literal quotes that they had said and kind of like rewording them and mixing also the quotes of like 90 people and compressing them down into sort of 4 basic experience storylines based on people's like sort of age and like other factors like length of binding and that kind of thing. And we made up like sort of 4 fictional composite characters that were sort of like, this is an archetype of a person whose binding experience was like this, and here's another whose experience was like this. And we made up these fictional characters and have them saying lines, some of which are pulled directly from the research quotes, but like talking about their lives, you know, like real people, but they are kind of like fictionalized archetype versions of real people.
Right. Yeah.
So, yes.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. All right. So let's open it up to some questions. And does anyone have some questions for Maia? Yes.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
What's that? Oh, tea. Oh, okay. I was like, is this a trick question about tea? I'm not. Fair enough.
I don't even want to open it. Oh, thank you.
As a parent of an unmarried child, thank you for genderqueer. It's made my child coming out as non-binary so much easier.
I'm so glad.
Thank you. That's.
Yeah.
Other questions?
I was just curious how you got a publication deal with Oni Press for genderqueer.
So one of the reasons that it can be helpful to go to grad school is to meet people and network. And one of my grad school classmates, Sam Satin, got a book deal with Oni before I did. And he was like a writer, so he's pitching as like the writer half of a writer-artist team. And he told me, hey, I think my editor would really like your work. Do you want me to send it to her? And I was like, yes, please. And he sent the editor, Andrea Colvin, my early black and white strips. And apparently she opened it and planned to only read 1 or 2 and like read all of them in like an hour and was like, yes, I'm interested in this. And so then he was like, she's gonna be at this event, which was San Diego Comic-Con, like at this panel, like go up, introduce yourself, say you're Sam's friend. And so I went up and like was like, hi, I'm that person that you got an email about. And she was like, yes, I'm very interested. Here's my business card, like let's talk. And she basically mentored me through the pitching process. Like she helped me. So it was very interesting, like having an editor sort of already interested. I didn't even have an agent yet at that time, but having an editor at the company sort of interested in the work. And so she helped me sort of put together the initial pitch, which was rejected, which is the, do you just want to publish all the existing materials. And then when that was rejected, she's like, don't worry, let's put it together again. And then we made it to the second pitch, which was like, I will redraw this into comic book size pages and we'll do it in color and it'll be more of a narrative. And then she was the editor that I worked on with the book. So that case, it was a very like knowing someone who knows someone situation. But with Saatchi, the more recent one, it was a very different process. So that one I basically sold on the strength of like a bunch of little zines. I never wrote a script. I never did character designs. I didn't have a pitch cover. Like I had nothing, frankly. And it's astonishing to me that I sold it on so little. With Saatchi, I wrote a full script. Lucky and I worked together to make character design sheets of all of the major characters. I also drew several of the important locations, like the main character's house and the main character's school. And then I drew like 12 sample pages of being like, this is the style that it would be, and this is kind of how we're imagining it to look. And then by that point I had signed with an agent. And then our agent set that, what's called a pitch packet, out to several publishers, I think 6. And we got offers from 4. And then we got to choose which offer we were interested in, which was very nice. And it ended up at Scholastic. So that's kind of two different ways that happened. And sometimes publishers will have an open call. For example, Silver Sprocket, the publisher based here in San Francisco, literally just had sort of an open call, which means anyone, including people who don't have an agent, can send in a pitch. And that pitch is, again, usually like script, character design, sample pages, bio of the author, that type of thing, kind of all put together into one PDF. And they, because I just did the event at Silver Sprocket, they apparently received over 700 submissions. So they have a lot of reading ahead of them. But depending on sort of the size of what publisher you want to pitch to, some publishers do not accept submissions directly from the author, they only accept them from an agent. And then some publishers will accept them only like from the author without an agent. So it really depends. So that's kind of 2 different ways to do that. Next year. Next year.
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of it depends on the kind of where the publishers are coming from, right? If they're the big book publishers, more likely to want to work with an agent.
Yeah.
If they're smaller press, maybe the queer press, or comics publishers, then you don't have to necessarily have an agent.
Yeah.
But other questions? Yeah.
I got to ask you this a couple months ago, but it's probably a changing landscape, so I figured I would ask you again. What are some actions that, like, what are activism things that people can do to be fighting the book challenges right now?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I mean, the main thing is, like, if you hear about a challenge happening in your library district, your school district, etc., like, show up, because it's really like local voices responding are actually more impactful than like if all of us emailed somebody in Texas about it right now, that wouldn't matter as much as if all the people who are in that county in Texas like responded, because like libraries and schools are like funded by like the local tax and are for the people who are like local, right? So if you hear about what's happening in your neighborhood or your school and you are able to, like, show up to a school board meeting, show up to a library board meeting, like, be one of the people who's holding a sign like, don't ban books, or, you know, if there's like a speaking opportunity where, you know, you usually can go for like 2 minutes at like a city council meeting and speak your piece, and that kind of thing, that is hugely impactful, because like, as we know from like the Moms for Liberty stuff, like they are organizing, they are like getting people and reaching out to people in all over the place. And also like they're making this sort of copycat challenge system. There was an article that I just referenced in my recent Nib post in the Washington Post where they analyzed 1,000 of the like 2,500 challenges that happened last year in the school year. I think that's how many they could get data for. And 60% of them, or 600, were submitted by 11 people. And so that's not that many people, and it means that probably only 1 or 2 are showing up at a library board meeting being like, this book's terrible and you should ban it. And if you have like 2 people shouting at you, it sucks and you can be really scared. But then if you have like 30 people being like, don't ban it, it's awesome, like then you can sort of weigh those voices. And like, I know like the librarians like really have to listen to the public, and like they're funded by the public, and just like showing up and supporting books. And then also if you can't show up in person, like sending an email, posting comments on their social media, and then also just like positively commenting on any kind of thing, like a banned book display, a Disability Month display, a Black History Month display, like a Trans Remembrance Day display, anything like that, telling a librarian like, hey, that's great, I love it, or like just like making sure that they're hearing from the people who are pro-book, pro-queer stories, pro-diverse stories, because the anti-people are really, really loud, but I actually don't, I think they're the minority. They're just like loud and organized. And so we need to be like louder and more organized than them. So yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
What advice would you give to someone wanting to foster more creativity and motivation in like a time when everybody's fighting for our attention?
I think that if you're trying to find inspiration to make art, it's like the first person you have to please is yourself. And I think that it's like audience is important, but like you have to be the first person who loves your work and who has like the desire to make it and who isn't going to give up in the middle because you sort of like realize that it's not something you actually care about. And so I think the most important thing first is just being like, you know, what do I have to say, or what makes me excited, or like what like do I keep thinking about, getting that thought sort of stuck in your head, and how do I put that into the world? And then I also think having like a sort of small audience in mind first, being like, I am drawing this for my mom, I am drawing this for my best friend, my cousin, my grandpa, whatever, and kind of like thinking like this is something I want to say, and this is the person I want to say it to, and making art kind of starting from there. And then that can often grow. Like often you start that and then you realize, oh, I thought of thinking my best friend, but it could also be for this other person. And like I think it kind of gains momentum in the creation of it. But I think especially if you're having struggle like starting with sort of from that place is quite useful. And also like starting small. Like instead of being like, I'm going to write the next great American graphic novel, being like, I am drawing one comic for Instagram or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
And I feel like I sort of tricked myself into writing a book by writing a bunch of tiny comics that were like, this is just little, like this isn't a big deal, you know. and then again you build and you build and suddenly you like in retrospect you look back and you're like, oh, this is like a book's worth of material. But it started with like a little journal comic that I did every day for several weeks or whatever.
I actually have my own sort of backup question to that, which is, memoir, I think, can function very differently depending on its size.
Yeah.
So when you're doing, short pieces, it's very easy to be like, oh, this like wacky thing happened to me. Like that's a fun thing to put together into as a short story.
But when you're like, oh, I'm making a book about myself, you really have to think of yourself as a character that has a character arc, that has emotional beats, and all these sort of little vignettes and stories have to add up to a larger arc. How did you square that circle?
I managed to like never learn the 3-act story structure.
Okay.
I don't know them.
Fair enough.
I don't know. I think that I read a ton. I read 100 books a year, and I have since 2003. This is like my 20th year of reading 100 books a year or more. So I think I've just really internalized the shape of stories that please me and that I like and that I find satisfying.
Are you reading right now? Is that what?
Maybe. And so, I mean, especially with genderqueer, I was like, this is slice of life. Like, we are not doing the like building up and then going down or whatever. I was just like, these are all these things that happened, and they became more pressing and urgent as I got older. Then I started to figure some stuff out, and then I explained it to some people, and then that just led to more things. And then that book had to end because I had reached the present. And you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
So I didn't think a lot about story structure when I was writing it, except that like the narrative of my life has been of, at first I didn't know anything, and then I learned a few things, and then I learned a few more things, and each thing kind of built on the thing I'd learned in the past. So there's this sort of growing upward arc of greater understanding and greater nuance and greater access to language. But aside from that, it doesn't like have a story arc, I don't think.
But yeah, every step that you learn more from, you also presents another set of challenges that you have to sort of move through.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
But that's life.
Yeah,
Sorta.
it's like the rings of a tree, you know, every one grows out and out and out and out, and it contains all of the other ones inside of it. And you don't know what the next ring is going to be, but like you grow and you grow and you grow, yeah.
And now that you're doing some fictional work, are you still?
That's where having a good editor is nice. But the fictional one, it's also like so helpful that I'm co-writing it with Lucky, because it means we have the power of our two brains together instead of just one brain alone. And I I love collaborating. And if you find someone you gel with and can collaborate with, I highly recommend it. And I do think that I think that when two people work together, you can really create something even better. So that was really helpful. And then we also have had rounds of revisions, so we went to crit groups, we had friends read it and ask for suggestions, and our editor also suggested a lot of feedback. So.
Takes a village. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you both, but also I'm going to present this
Aw.
to Maya from the California legislature.
Wow.
Certificate of recognition for Maia Kobabe, recognizing Maia Kobabe on the memorable occasion of receiving the San Francisco Zine Fest Guest of Honor.
Oh my God.
Your work as an advocate and storyteller for and about queer communities while highlighting your artistic talent has had a profound impact. You are a shining example of how the arts enlighten and strengthen while simultaneously challenge the status quo. Congratulations on this notable achievement.
Oh my God.
Wow. All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming to SF Zine Fest and for helping us celebrate this with Maya. So give it up for Maia Kobabe.
Yeah.
There it is.
I think this is like the biggest, fanciest piece of paper with my master's degree.